have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Koen Davidse. Koen is the Director of Peace Building and Stabilization at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, but is also the envoy to Sudan for the ministry. Previous to this appointment with the Netherlands government, Koen has worked as a research director with the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on UN system-wide coherence, and also as a minister plenipotentiary chairing the negotiations for the 2005 summit on development issues. He has worked with the World Bank as a senior advisor to the executive director and has coordinated for the Dutch government the EU presidency on human rights and humanitarian affairs. With such a wealth of experience, Koen, we could have not asked to have any better discussant for the very wide challenges that Luca and Amir have put on the table. The floor is to you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here, and we're very happy to be associated with the work ODI is doing on fragile states. We're trying to do good as the Netherlands on fragile states, but listening to you both, Luca was talking about Sudan having Dutch disease, and Amir was talking about Afghanistan and security issues, and I remember vividly that when I visited you in Kabul once, that you said that the Dutch embassy was such a nice building before the Dutch moved in, and created a blast wall and did all kinds of things to it because it was apparently a nice place with a nice garden. So we don't always do good. I've listened with great interest to both Luca and Amira, and I think they said some very valuable things. And I come to this discussion with a couple of hats on, which you've mentioned already, in the sense that looking at Sudan, looking at peace building in general, also being very involved in discussions within the OECD as co-chair of the network on fragile states there, which is called INCAF, and which has nothing to do with Starbucks. And last but not least, the thing that was mentioned, that I was director of the Secretariat of the Coherence Panel in 2006 that Kofi Annan had instituted to look at issues of UN coherence, and early recovery was a very important part of the discussions of that panel. And the conclusion was that sequencing and giving the UN the right role, the World Bank the right role, could be of help, and looking indeed into capacity issues. So I think all the issues that were mentioned here were very much came to the fore during those discussions. And from the Dutch policy perspective, I would say that the importance of looking at issues of fragility and early recovery cannot be overstated. We cannot just look at the countries that are on the highway to the Millennium Development Goals, because so many of the poorest live in countries that are on the gravel path. And if you look at the statistics mentioned on maternal mortality, I think a staggering figure was mentioned last week by UNICEF in Sudan, I think of 26,000. It is mind-boggling what those statistics really mean. So we need to look at fragility, and I think there is a general recognition. The UN has been doing a lot of work on it. Robert Zoellick, since he has become president of the World Bank, has been focusing on it, as Lucas said, and a lot of bilateral governments are focusing on it. That doesn't mean that we always know what to do, and that is why it's good to have meetings like this one here. Looking at what I heard just now, I think, first of all, our chair rightly said that there's a middle ground between the humanitarian and development phase that is ill-defined, and that needs to be looked at. I think Luca raised a couple of very important issues, including a call on donors to act jointly, a focus on issues of crowding out of development expenditure by military expenditure because of the security situation, the fact that access through services sometimes is better in the war phase or the humanitarian phase than in the phase after, the issue of managing expectations, and also moving from a military to a civilian mindset. I think those were all very important issues. Amira raised core issues that I would also like to stress, the importance of ownership, because that's the difference between the phase of the humanitarian phase and the development phase, the issue of timing, and the issue, of course, the all-encompassing issue of security. I think the case of Sudan in general and Southern Sudan in particular is crucial in its own right, in the sense that Sudan is at a crucial stage. A civil war was ended with great success. Elections are upcoming. There's an important moment in 2011 when Sudan has to decide whether it's going to be one country or not. And I think the international community is rightly interested, concerned, and implicated, and the international community will find ways to support Sudan in going through these processes, because it's an important country in itself, and because it's a neighbor of a lot of African countries. It is crucial to the stability of Africa. But also, the case of Sudan helps us learn lessons on early recovery and the issues that we've been talking about. And I think as international partners of Sudan, we constantly have to ask ourselves the question, did we do the right things, and did we do the right things right? Because the issue of sequencing was raised. And I think it's important to look at a study which ODI also referred to in its note on early recovery by the Center of International Cooperation of New York University last year, which said that on early recovery, on peace building, that there are significant gaps in terms of strategy. What do you really want to achieve? International community and local partners together. Issues of capacity, which both Luca and Amira referred to, and funding. And not just the quantity of funding, but also the quality of funding. That's what Amira also discussed, whether the funding just goes into humanitarian funding, which clinically I would call consumption for development, or whether it goes into development funding, which I would call investment. So those are important issues that are at play in the case of Sudan. And I think if you look at the middle ground that the chair talked about, there definitely is a gap, as was demonstrated also in the first slide of Amira, where you have to do a lot of things at the same time. A need to provide for peace dividend, for visible services, as Amira called it, while humanitarian resources are often dwindling. It's difficult to mobilize them. I think the appeal for Sudan for next year will be around $1.2 billion, $1.8 billion, which is quite an amount. Where you can, the second issue, of course, the issue of capacity and ownership, the governance connection, which needs to be right at the same time. And last but not least, of course, addressing issues of security. And there is no sequencing between these things because, for instance, security is related to employment. If young men don't have jobs, then they could start doing other things. In the case of Southern Sudan, Luca already listed the number of international instruments that were set up to try and assist Southern Sudan. And I think there is reason to say that we did the right things, but in the wrong order, in the sense that there is a common humanitarian fund that coordinates the donors, as Luca wants in the humanitarian sense. But we started with the most difficult thing, a fund looking at long-term investment, while there should have been funds or instruments looking at short-term delivery of services. They're there now, but it's taken a long time. And there's a lot of money now stuck in that bigger fund, and there's no good rules to move money from one fund to the other. So there's a lot of lessons in terms of governance for donors and for the government of Southern Sudan, and also a lesson to say that, of course, the World Bank should be involved early on in these processes. It should be there to give advice, but it shouldn't always be there immediately to run the projects. Maybe others should do that. So I think that's a very important thing. Secondly, the issue of state capacity. How do you build state capacity? It's incredibly difficult and incredibly important, also for the faith and confidence that people, international partners, the local population have in the government. And there's definitely a lot of governance issues in Southern Sudan. The government is now dealing with a grain scandal. There's a compact now between the donors and the government to try and deal with the macroeconomic management issues that Amir referred to. And if you have a lack of capacity, these are difficult issues to deal with. And that brings me to the point of the risk of the situation not being unilinear, in the sense that if you have a recurrence of violence, such as Amira indicated in her last slide, and if you have an increase in the number of IDPs, you don't want that kind of situation to happen. You do want the situation to stabilize and to help the government achieve that. So I think also in my lessons are not very different from the lessons that both Amira and Luca have mentioned. The issue of sequencing and timing is important. The issue of jointness is important. And I do think that Luca is absolutely right in calling on donors to work jointly. We have established a joint donor office in Southern Sudan, which is a unique configuration, donors working together. I can tell you, donors working together is a pain. But we're trying and we're doing our best to create the least problems for the government and to create a united front. I think the idea of working with these big trust funds is still a good idea, but you have to make sure that the funds are there for the right reasons at the right time and are not too complicated and not working on too big a project. And instead, you might want to work on the smaller pieces that can make a difference in the short run. And that brings me to the point of the need to have the right presence on the ground of the international community, to have the people there to help with procurement law that Amira mentioned, to have the people who run the trust funds, and to maybe not have a lot of other people who are doing things that are not right for the right circumstances. The issue of capacity needs to be addressed. It needs to be, in general, part of the conflict settlements that you have. It needs to be part of post-conflict needs assessments. When you go into a country to assess the needs, you should also assess the capacity needs. We are now the host donor of the Capacity Building Trust Fund, which is going into its second phase. It's an incredibly important fund, but it's also not an easy challenge, because how do you build capacity with a trust fund? So it's definitely something that really will take a lot of attention. The issue of political will and prioritization is still something that needs to be emphasized, because if you want to move from a military situation to a more civilian situation, you will definitely need that. And in the longer term, of course, the issue of diversification and employment. Luca was referring to the fact that Sudan does suffer from Dutch disease because of its oil revenues, and yeah, there definitely needs to be a movement to basically develop agriculture and other industries. So I think in general, for the specific case of Sudan, we have to learn lessons fast, and as an international community, we have to assist the government as best as we can, led by the UN, led by the World Bank. And I do think we can draw a lot of lessons which will serve us in other cases to do better. Thank you.